Hi guys, it's the Island Girl and I'm back with another video for you today. And today I'm checking out the North Sea tsunami, Britain's deadliest disaster. Now Peter recommended this one and we're going to get right into this video. So if you're new to my channel and it's the first time here, come on in, right back, put a smile on your face and enjoy. To all my regular schmegler day one, sweetie pie, sweetie poos, come on in, right back, put a smile on your face and enjoy. Well, I don't think this is anything to be smiling about. Come on in. If you haven't heard it before, come and learn something with the Island Girl. Pretty much that. All right. So without further ado, we're going to get into this video. All right, guys. So here we go. Right now.
It's the deadliest natural disaster in British history. Roughly 8,000 years ago, a gigantic submarine landslide off the coast of Scandinavia triggered a tsunami the likes of which Europe had never seen. In an instant, enough sediment collapsed to bury the whole of Scotland to a depth of 8 meters. So much water was displaced that it created a vast wave which came crashing into Britain at 80 miles per hour, reaching up to 40 meters high. The water obliterated everything in its path. Rivers and estuaries were inundated. Entire coastal communities were just swept away. It's estimated that up to a quarter of Britain's Mesolithic population died, making it, per capita, the deadliest disaster in British history. And yet Britain wasn't even the worst affected region. That honor would go to the now lost area that's been called Northern Europe's Atlantis, Doggerland. A lush, low-lying plain connecting Britain to the mainland, Doggerland was the closest the Mesolithic world had to an Eden. But when the tsunami hit, it would become ground zero for a catastrophe beyond imagination. Join us today as we explore both the lost world of Doggerland and Britain's prehistoric apocalypse.
That is crazy. Just the way he started out, it just sends you into a tizzy, like heartbreaking. That's so much life loss. What a disaster. Jeezy whiz. And it's my first sunken world. I've never heard anything about this. It's my first time.
Picture in your head a map of Northern Europe. You can probably conjure its most famous features with ease. Denmark poking out of the top of Germany, Scandinavia looking weirdly like some guy's leprosy-afflicted genitals, and of course Britain and Ireland floating apart from the rest, defiantly doing their own thing. Got that? Well, now we're going to take that map and move it back in time, all the way back to the end of the last ice age. The Northern Europe you'd see back then would look completely different. During the last ice age, Europe's sea level was a staggering 122 meters lower. Instead of a separate Britain and Ireland, you just had one gigantic clump of land attached to the rest of Europe by a swath of desolate, scrub-filled tundra. This tundra was essentially uninhabited, until, that is, the world began warming. As the ice sheet slowly retreated, prehistoric humans pushed north following the wild animals. To their presumed surprise, they soon found themselves in an ancient paradise. Where the tundra had once stood, now lay a vast, low plain teeming with life. In this warming world, one slightly warmer than today, there would have been forests, lakes, valleys, lagoons, meadows, estuaries. Wild berries grew in abundance alongside hazelnuts and other foods that were perfect for foraging. Animals grazed along the shorelines while the waters teemed with fish. Today we call this lost world Doggerland, but for Mesolithic Europeans, it probably had a different name. For around 100,000 ancient humans, it was simply known as home. Not that the migration stopped at Doggerland. Just as the plain became home to scattered settlements, so too did the island of Britain. Of course, it wasn't actually an island then, even as the melting ice sheet slowly revealed its modern contours. For thousands more years, Britain would be attached to Europe via Doggerland, no more separate than Italy is today. But whether the migrants settled on the plain or in Britain itself, one thing is certain. For these hunter-gatherers, it would have been a time of plenty. Compared to our mental images of the Stone Age as a time when dudes lived in caves and hit each other on the head with clubs, life in this ancient lands would have been surprisingly sophisticated. People likely lived in semi-permanent camps of perhaps 10 to a few dozen people, keeping to the shores and estuaries in the fall and winter and heading inland to hunt during the summer. These camps would be moved and rebuilt as needed, allowing for a near-nomadic lifestyle. but nomadic doesn't mean unadvanced. We have evidence of boat building, tool making, and even the construction of ancient wooden slipways. And this last one is important as it suggests Mesolithic Britons and Doggerlanders spent more time cooperating than they did fighting over who had the best loincloth. Evidence has even been uncovered of annual social events when all the region's tribes would gather, often on low cliffs overlooking sealing grounds. Aside from an excuse to hold the Stone Age equivalent of Glastonbury Festival, these gatherings would have also allowed the young to find mates. They would have likely been storytelling too. With no written language, these bygone cultures would have had oral traditions telling a whole cycle of now lost stories about their forgotten gods. In short, this was a vibrant world with complex societies interacting over hundreds of kilometers. Sadly, it would be these humans that bore the brunt of the coming disaster.
Now that makes sense, because normally when you hear about the Stone Age, you hear about these vicious people running down, hunting each other and can't get along. But it kind of makes more sense with what he said. Look, you know what? They were living in an area where it had enough food. There need to be no fighting, and then you have the different little tribes settling in different places. I can see them gathering where the crossing of, you know what, them getting a mate and all of that, and sitting down and listen to them telling stories about their ancestors in their language. It's crazy that, well, we don't have any written history of that, but we can presume that was the case before the wave. Okay.
Even before the tsunami struck, there were signs that this whole warming world thing was changing Doggerland's fortunes. A few millennia before, most of the northern hemisphere had been buried under ice, including Canada and America. Now, as that ice thawed, those places were experiencing dramatic changes. Over in the modern US, so much meltwater came off the glaciers that it formed a gigantic lake known as Lake Agassiz. In fact, the word gigantic doesn't really do it justice. Lake Agassiz was bigger than all of today's Great Lakes combined, closer in size to the Black Sea than Lake Superior. When it finally burst its banks, the whole world knew about it. Around 6,200 BC, Lake Agassiz sent all of its water flooding out into the North Atlantic. Over in ancient Europe, this sudden influx of water caused the sea level to noticeably rise. And with that rise came some dramatic changes. See, Lake Agassiz disrupted the Atlantic circulation of warm water, causing temperatures to drop. For Doggerland, that meant a 1-2 punch of vanishing coastline and sudden cold winds pummeling its shores. The result was a land no longer such a paradise, one where fertile land was replaced by marshes and jagged coastline. As Doggerland shrank, so too did Britain's physical connection to mainland Europe. Within maybe a century, all that remained was a narrow land bridge and a scattering of low-lying, swampy islands. Yet this wasn't the end of the region. While the changes were bad for some, it allowed others to thrive, those who transitioned to a life ever more based around fishing and boat building. For some, the changes were probably beneficial. Sadly, rising sea levels weren't the only changes the retreating glaciers were producing. Off the coasts of modern Norway, shifts were underway that would soon spell doom for Mesolithic Britain. Far beneath the seabed, huge chambers of long-frozen methane were beginning to thaw. This methane had been frozen solid during the Ice Age, but the warming world turned it back into a gas. Since it was still trapped underground, this transformation was hugely destabilizing for Norway's continental shelf. Unfortunately, even as things grew less stable underground, they became shaky above ground too. As the glaciers, once covering Scandinavia, retreated, they'd taken untold cubic kilometers of ice with them. Since ice is really, really heavy, this meant the ground above Norway was suddenly no longer being pressed down on, just as gas started bubbling up like crazy below it. Today, scientists believe this combination led to major earthquakes. And at some point, in 6,200 BC, the biggest earthquake yet struck. The Storegga slide remains the third biggest known submarine slide in history. Over just a few hours, nearly 300 kilometers of continental shelf collapsed, displacing 3,000 cubic kilometers of debris. Had a slip this size somehow happened on land, it would have been enough to bury the whole of Scotland. Underwater, though, it instead displaced an unimaginable amount of seawater. As we saw with the Indian Ocean in 2004 and Japan in 2011, such displaced seawater doesn't just make a bit of a splash and then resettle on the surface. It creates a wave, a rushing, powerful, overwhelming wall of water that radiates out in all directions, sweeping across the oceans until it finally crashes up against land. In
Jeez.
tsunami-prone cultures like Japan, these waves happen often enough that the natives try to prepare for them, even
By
in ancient
running,
times.
yeah.
But Europe isn't a place regularly exposed to tsunamis. At the moment the Storegga slide sent its annihilating wave shooting out across the water, it's unlikely anyone in Britain or Doggerland had any idea that the sea was capable of such a thing. If that's the
Wow.
case, they were in for a rude awakening. Although
Jeez.
no one could have known it at the time, Britain was about to experience the deadliest day in its entire history.
Ouch. The flood just makes your tummy turn. And I've been looking into the UK for a minute now, and it's my first time hearing about this, like I said before. And this is very interesting because I did not know that this took place. It's crazy. It's a lot to take in. Okay, let's continue.
The
The
key
flood.
thing that made the North Sea tsunami so deadly is the time of year it occurred. Thanks to ancient fruit stones discovered in the layers of sediment it left behind, we know the tsunami must have landed in autumn. The most likely estimate is around late October. This was a
Okay.
problem because autumn was when Mesolithic peoples returned from their summers hunting on higher ground to settle in beside the coast for winter. Although
Oh.
Britain's population is thought to have been a mere 50,000 at this time, nearly all of them were concentrated in coastal areas, most of which were on the east coast, aka exactly where a giant killer wave was about to hit. In Doggerlands, it was even worse. Nearly entirely low-lying Doggerlands was like the Netherlands without its seawalls, flood defenses, or excellent cheese. A flat space, a spilled pint of beer could probably inundate. This meant most of its inhabitants stood a roughly zero chance of surviving what came next. Obviously, since there were no written records at this time, we don't know exactly what the catastrophe looked like. But we can guess. If it occurred in the daytime, there were likely primitive boats just offshore, fires burning outside Stone Age tents. Maybe people were working, maybe they were playing or eating, or in the middle of some ritual. Maybe neighbors were simply sat together gossiping while they kept one eye on their children. Whatever the truth, there's no ambiguity about what came next. Up in the Shetland Islands off Scotland's northern tip, these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers would have all fallen silent, stopped what they were doing, as the sea mysteriously vanished. In an instant, the waters would have retreated, pulling far, far back, exposing shore that likely hadn't seen daylight since Lake Agassiz came pouring into the Atlantic. Today, most of us know that this is nature's way of telling you to run like hell.
Yep.
But no one in Mesolithic Britain could have known this. They likely just watched, puzzled, maybe scared, as the sea did something they'd never seen it do before. Somewhere between a few seconds and a few minutes later, the horror began. A wave up to 40 meters high came crashing in at a speed of 35 meters per second. At such speeds, water feels less like how you'd expect it to feel and more like a moving, churning, boiling wall of concrete. Those on the shore may have just had enough time to realize they were dead before it struck, sweeping entire coastal communities away. After that, it was the rest of Britain's turn. Mainland Scotland was next to be hit, with a 20-meter wave crashing into its east coast. Estuaries and rivers helped funnel the devastation inland, wiping out fishing communities that were a whole day's travel from the sea. Evidence from the Forth River shows the waters might have cascaded over 30 kilometers into the interior, causing devastation the entire way. This was a pattern that repeated over and over as the wave reached modern England. Valleys filled with water, estuaries were inundated, marshlands flooded. But the worst was reserved for Doggerland. Being the geographical equivalent of a flat tabletop, Doggerland didn't stand a chance. The wave simply washed over it, drowning everything in its path. Of Doggerland's estimated population of 100,000, it's unknown how many could have possibly survived. Overall, the wave inundated nearly 7,000 square kilometers of Britain, equivalent to the whole of Delaware sinking beneath the waves. Sadly, this was just the warm-up act. Over the next few hours, 2 more powerful tsunamis crashed into the devastated coastal communities, killing who knows how many ancient first responders. By the time the last wave ended its path of destruction, East Britain and Doggerland had been devastated. Our best estimate.
You're telling me that it wasn't just one, 2 more came in and went through. Can you imagine these people sitting there, see the water recede, and they don't know what hit them? They were surprised, in awe, they're puzzled, so much emotion going on at that time. And then, like he said, they don't know what is coming next. But, can you imagine them looking on them like, okay, what is that? Maybe something from the gods, how in their thing, how what they believe back then. And in less than a minute or so, you look and you see this water coming, and there's nothing you can do. You look, you see your family from left to right, your kids, husbands, wives, I'm like, ooh, panicking, but what can you do? Nothing at all. There was so many lives lost. 70,000 roughly on Doggerland. And then on the other side, he was saying around 5,000. That, oh, that's a lot to take in.
Estimates suggest that around 12,000 people lost their lives in Britain, with untold more dying in Doggerland. Even today, this grim tally would make it one of the deadliest natural disasters to ever strike Britain. Adjusted for population, it stands second to none. Only the Black Death in the 14th century killed a larger percentage of Britons. And still, the tsunami's effects weren't over. In fact, its victims would be living with them for centuries to come.
What? Can you imagine that? So 12,000 in Britain alone.
Generally, when a large-scale disaster strikes the modern world, there are agencies like FEMA on standby to stop the aftermath becoming even worse than the actual cataclysm.
True.
Of course, this doesn't always pan out, as anyone living in New Orleans in 2005 could tell you, but there's usually at least an attempt at disaster relief, an effort to alleviate suffering. Sadly, the Mesolithic world didn't work like this. After the trio of tsunamis had battered them senseless, the prehistoric Britons were left to fend for themselves. Not only did they have to deal with a death toll unlike anything they'd ever seen, but also the loss of everything that they'd held dear. Camps would have been swept away, along with any food the inhabitants had stored for winter. Tools, too, would have been lost, and it's not very likely they could just pop down to the nearest store to pick up a new set. Vital fishing boats would have been destroyed. Many of the community's hunters might have been dead or injured, and perhaps even entire oral histories were lost when the older folk drowned. Creatures living in the coastal waters would have been badly impacted too, destroying the most immediate source of food these devastated communities had. In short, surviving may have been worse than dying, and it's now thought many of the initial survivors died from the after effects during the winter. But even those who made it through to spring weren't out of the woods. In Denmark, there's some archaeological evidence that communities hit by the tsunami turned to warfare in the aftermath to win enough resources to survive. It's possible, if not likely, that something similar happened in Britain and Doggerland. If it did, then the first few years after the catastrophe were likely so grim they'd make 2020 look like a year of candy floss and unicorns. It's interesting to imagine how it must have felt to live through these desperate times, how it must have felt to have your perspective so fundamentally altered, the sea going from a benign source of food to a tyrant god capable of devouring your entire world. In the Chinese sci-fi trilogy, The Three-Body Problem, there's a character who becomes terrified of the sun, unable to even go outside in daytime after he discovers its sheer destructive potential. Who knows if these long-forgotten humans came to feel the same way about the ocean? In the end, it's thought that Britain's population took several centuries to recover. To give you some perspective,
it is just heart-wrenching to listen to. I know it's a part of history, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, just thinking about it. Okay, you go through this and you come out, say, okay, man, I still have a life. But yet still, it's worse in a sense because there's no food, the winter coming on, no shelter, no, all your resources gone. Everything you hold there gone. You're trying to pick up the pieces, but what is there to pick up? Nothing. You're just trying to survive in this harsh condition. Man. And then he's saying that in another part there was like war going on, try to get something to support their area. Because guess what? Nobody really have any resources to help themselves. And then back then, like I say, you didn't have any relief from any other country to go and help. Oh, jeez.
A quarter of Britons dying would have been equivalent to about 16.5 million people being wiped out today. But life goes on, and recover people did. Even Doggerland recovered, at least for a while. For a long time, it was thought that the Storegga tsunami marked the moment Doggerland's vanished forever beneath the waves. But nowadays, it's thought the land survived the catastrophe. Its landscape altered, but not annihilated. However, it couldn't survive what was to come next. As the glaciers continued
More?
to melt and the sea levels kept on rising, Doggerland, at last, became uninhabitable. As the waters rushed over its surface, cutting Britain off from Europe forever, its desperate people migrated en masse to the island. There's even a theory that it was the descendants of the Doggerlanders who settled Orkney off the coast of Scotland and built the Great Stone Age structures there. Around 5500 BC, the last traces of Doggerland sank for good. By then, all memories of the gigantic wave that caused so much chaos probably faded away. It had been a one-off event, a freak accident that had killed many, but was far from a regular occurrence. Or was it? Given how destructive the North Sea tsunami was, scientists today are struggling to answer a chilling question. Could it happen again?
Let's wave of the future. Let's find out if that's the case.
If you live in Britain, your experience with tsunamis is probably relegated solely to news reports from other nations.
Yeah.
Despite being surrounded by water, Britain rarely suffers from the ocean in the same way that Japan does. Sure, occasionally some massive storms might brew up and wash away a load of coastal roads and rail tracks, as happened during the winter of 2013. But by and large, the chances of watching your house gaily sailing away atop a wave are roughly zero. Or so we Brits like to believe. However, go digging into the historical record and you'll find more waves than you might expect. The greatest of these was likely the one that hit the Bristol Channel in early 1607 or late 1606 under the old Julian calendar. On January the 30th, floodwaters suddenly swept up the channel from the Atlantic, drowning entire villages and washing away herds of livestock. The inundation killed around 2,000 people and left its mark on churches and old stone bridges across the region. But while a tsunami is suspected as being the cause, a storm surge can't be ruled out. Things are more certain where the Cornwall tsunami is concerned. In 1755, an offshore earthquake leveled the Portuguese city of Lisbon while also sending tsunami waves shooting out in all directions. One of these impacted southern Cornwall. While no one actually counted the number killed, it was declared that there was great loss of life. So tsunamis and Britain, while rarely seen together, are not total strangers. But there are two other tsunamis in Britain's geological record, and frighteningly, they hit exactly where the North Sea tsunami did. Around 3000 BC, and then again in 500 AD, Shetland was hit by two tsunamis at least 12 meters high. In each case, what caused them is a bit of a mystery, but it does seem to show killer waves devastating Scotland are not quite rare enough. That being said, the chances of a tsunami battering Britain in your lifetime are extremely small, almost unimaginably so.
Okay.
And this is a big but, that's not the same thing as those chances being zero. Thanks to climate change, there are currently processes taking place beneath the North Sea that could potentially spell destruction. As in the run-up to the Storegga slide, trapped methane in places like Greenland could well be melting, even as local glaciers retreat. As the 21st century grinds on, we may find the combination triggers earthquakes, leading to submarine landslides. While these slips would almost certainly be too small to cause many noticeable effects, there is an outside chance that a Storegga-sized event could happen again. If it does, all bets are off. Were this new slip to take place near Svalbard or Greenland, it could send a cascade of water hurtling towards Scotland unseen since that fateful autumn day 8,000 years ago. Waves taller than 10 meters could come crashing into Edinburgh and Newcastle, causing destruction on a massive scale. Bridges would be swept away, cars would be picked up and carried like toys. Fires would break out, smaller buildings would crumble and break, and everywhere people would be caught up in the water's embrace, killed as surely as if they'd stepped in front of a freight train. If you've ever watched the footage of the Japanese tsunami sweeping inland, you'll know what horrors to expect. The slow-moving wall of death, the flood that obliterates roads and rail tracks, the untold numbers dying. Thankfully, though, this nightmare scenario remains purely hypothetical. While the San Andreas fault or the Cascadia earthquake will certainly unleash chaos at some point in the next century or two, the next great North Sea tsunami may never come. It could be that another 8,000 years from now, our distant descendants are still waiting for that next great wave. But that won't change the fact that the real disaster already happened. 8 millennia ago, the peoples of two regions were forced to watch as everything they held dear was destroyed. It was a cataclysm on par with anything in modern history. The Titanic, 9/11, 1906 San Francisco earthquake, they all pale compared to this ancient catastrophe. The main difference is that we were able to record those other tragedies, to write articles and make videos, to record our stories so the disaster wouldn't be forgotten. In the case of the North Sea tsunami, no such records existed. Nothing survived to tell us how it felt to be those ancient hunters watching their world crumble around them. Nothing but a layer of sediment in the geological record, waiting patiently for someone to decode something that finally happened in our lifetimes. Now, at long
Man,
last, the story of that bygone tsunami's victims can be told, their forgotten suffering finally understood. So I'm not going to ask whether you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below.
man, I ain't gonna lie. I'm not going to lie. That right there was crazy. Crazy. Man, I'm so lost for words because, like I said, I had no idea that this took place in Britain. So much devastation, so many lives lost. And he said it would be up to about 16 millions to date if you have to look at it, compare it to now of lives wiped out. I'm like, just imagine being there, seeing your kids and your family, friends running around, and all of a sudden you see the water just pulled to the sea. You're looking at land that you have never graced your eyes on before. And then all of a sudden you see it coming towards you. There's what can you do? Where can you run? You're on the low-lying area. Who can you save? All those things must be rushing through their heads. Man. And then Dogalan. It's my first time hearing that name as well. Thank you, Peter, for requesting this one. I hope you guys find this video interesting, because I sure did, because that's a piece of history, your guys' history, that I did not know. And I fall in love with your country, and I'm learning as much as I can about it. Man, it's your island girl, and I'm running out of here. Don't forget to go in the comment section. Tell me what you'd like me to react to next, because it will be done. Continue to do what? Rock back, relax, and enjoy your lives. Love you guys, and I'll definitely catch you guys in another video. Bye. Wow, man. That's a hefty one, guys. It really is.